From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
First of all, thank you very much for being here. I'm very pleased to see this amount of people here. This is great because it's supposed to be a very comfortable, casual type of interaction here. I will be playing a few pieces, and I'll play some examples of things, but other than that, it's really a chance just to talk about what's going on, and I'll show you some of these very interesting manuscripts that we have at the Library of Congress. And I should say, first of all, my name is David Plylar, and I work in the music division. One of my great interests in music really is Liszt, the music of Franz Liszt. I've given a few talks before you might have known about on the funeral odes that we also have at the Library of Congress and the historical Hungarian portraits. A lot of these pieces tend to be late in Liszt's life when he composed them, and for some reason I'm particularly drawn to those. What we're going to be looking at today is the largest collection of manuscript sources for the third book, third year of the Année de Pelerinage, the Years of Pilgrimage. The first two books came out in, I think, the 1850s, although they were written starting in the 1830s, various pieces from them. The first one was the Swiss volume, the second one was the Italy volume, and the third one is sometimes kind of erroneously called Italy, but it is based on more spiritual types of things in Liszt's life in the 1870s for the most part. Although he continued to make revisions to these pieces up until their publication in 1883. It's one of, I think it's widely regarded as one of his best late sets of piano pieces, with good reason. They're very, to me, they're very visionary works and very meaningful. You can just tell that he put a great deal into them. One of the most famous pieces in the piano literature happens to come from this Le Jeu d'eau à la Villa d'Este, which is basically the font of all fountains that often came after it with Ravel and Debussy. That work I will not be playing today, thankfully for me, because it's a monster, but it's a beautiful piece and a wonderful piece. But we do not have material for that work. What we do have are materials for the first three pieces in the set, and then the fifth work in the set. And I thought I would just take them in order because they offer different aspects of the editing process and the sketch process that we'll take a look at. So the first piece, I believe, is one of Liszt's favorite pieces of his towards the end of his life, called Angelus. It's basically he subtitles it a prayer to the guardian angel. And he made, I think there's about 6 different versions for piano of this piece and before you get to the final version. And there's also potentially 2 or 3 versions for string quartet. There's also another version for string quintet or string orchestra. And these all come into play in kind of interesting ways with the manuscripts that we have at the Library of Congress. The one that gets referenced in the literature the most is a copyist manuscript by a student of Liszt named Richard Burmeister. And he, at least that's what's given to us in an unknown hand on the copyist manuscript. So we think it was his. But you can see Liszt's annotations and going over it in this manuscript, and we'll be able to take a look at that physically over here. We have a second round that is never referenced, at least that I can find, in the same hand, Burmeister or otherwise, where he takes the edits of the first one and puts them into the second version, and it's getting awfully close to the final version, but is still not quite there. And the different types of alternate things that come up in this particular piece tend to be additions or decisions to make a repeat of an idea. This is it's actually interesting. Excuse me, I just need a quick drink. this idea of the repeat is kind of central to Liszt in general. The way that he puts material out there often involves a statement and then a restatement. Sometimes that restatement is in another key or something like that, but it's kind of a central thing. And if you listen to most of the Liszt pieces that you like, you'll notice that there is this type of developed repeat or a literal repeat of some of this expository types of material. What becomes interesting is when these types of repeats either have a echo effect on a more micro level, or they have a kind of an insertion or elongation effect. And so those are the types of things that we'll see in the Liszt, in the Angelus. So first, I'm just going to play a couple of these examples of the types of material that are getting this type of treatment repeated. This one's okay. So just to give you context, here's the version without the repeat. So what wasn't repeated, which is a little bit hard to know when you haven't heard it repeated, was just this little chunk right here. So in the final version, he does it twice. And then it continues on. So a very minor thing, but it's the kind of thing that tends to change the pacing of the entire work. Another example of this. Another example of this takes an earlier version that was further explored, and I'm kind of extrapolating what I think Liszt was going to do in this version. And this is where, in the final version, what you have is this. So the part that got repeated was this. So it was originally not repeated. And in fact, the harmonic rhythm of the entire section that comes after it was quite different. Yet the same harmonically, but it's just more compacted. It sounded like something like that. The rest of the material is obscured. Liszt crossed off all these things or wrote on top of them, so it's not always easy to tell exactly what he's doing, but an earlier version of this piece, he does that sort of a thing. So that's another type of change that you'll find. I won't play this example, but there are things such as little margin additions that come into play. So he'll be doing something and then just do it again in the margin as an afterthought, as another repeated thing. But again, it's the same idea of just repeating an idea, a small, usually 2-measure cell. Then we have a different way of dealing with transitions. So here are a couple of examples of ways that Liszt dealt with a transitional passage, or actually the end of this particular section. So that's the first one that's in the earliest manuscript, and he crosses this out. And in its place puts something like this. So that's close to the final version, but not yet there. in that copyist manuscript, which is the second one that he does put in the final version, after crossing that, what we just heard out, he puts that in. So you'll hear that in a moment. Another type of change has to do with the repetition of two-bar chunks as well, but in this case, they're chunks that evolve in terms of where the music is moving from. And I apologize if I have to go back and forth so much. I made versions of all the manuscripts on top of each other so that you can kind of see them, but it makes it a little bit awkward when I'm trying to find them here. Okay, so here's the earliest version of this little passage. Here's a second version. Now there are two very important differences here. I mean, relative to some of the other changes, maybe not that important, but I think that they're quite important. You hear this, and the new edition is adding this. So it just does something to the spacing and the pacing of the work. And there's also a difference that comes into play with respect to the voicings, the octaves. So you hear this in the first version. You have this low bass octave included. And when he changes it, it goes to this. So you lose that low octave. And I think that there's a practical reason for this. Because Liszt was very much, he always uses octaves mostly for color. It's not so much about volume or something like that. In this case, I think he ended up liking that particular color of just using the one octave because he was making an alternate version for harmonium. And so in the final version of the piece that was published, there's one particular passage, the biggest passage of the work, where you have a harmonium option available, but the harmonium range is not as large as that of a piano, so it's been reduced, and that's why it's given as another option. In the manuscript that we have, or one of the manuscripts that we have of this, Liszt puts in 3 different spots where he has alternate harmonium parts that lose this octave in the appropriate spots, and so that's one of the reasons that I think it's not there. One of the other interesting things about this, I should say, is that both manuscripts that we have related to Angelus say that they're transcriptions from the string quartet version, which is a little, is probably just wrong, but it also could be that Liszt made several different versions of the string quartet version, and then this particular copyist was working from that, and I'm not quite sure which it is, but the timing of it, the earliest drafts of it come from well before, and they're for piano, before this 1882 draft that we have. But it's interesting that it's still kind of finding its place up until its publication in 1883. So you get this real sense that the piece is not finalized, although earlier iterations are quite beautiful and quite interesting and worth checking out. On that note, I should say that, are any of you aware of the pianist Leslie Howard? He is a very interesting pianist and musicologist who did, he's in the Guinness Book of World Records for doing the largest solo recording project of any pianist ever, and that is the complete piano works of Liszt. And so that includes, I think, 99 CDs plus. So it took him, and he's still doing other projects now. So I mean, he really, I'm not sure how he got through it, but he plays through 5 of the 6 versions of Angelus in that set. And there are a few others that he actually doesn't play some of the alternatives that we're going to hear today. So I imagine that eventually he might add another supplemental volume to it to include these things. But he does, if you want to hear these things in the context of an entire performance, it's worth checking out, just so you're aware of that. They do. So that So the question was, how do you know which one's which? The problem is that you have to always update it once you find a new one. Often they'll use what are called serial numbers. There's a new catalog that's been in the works for 20-something years that's coming out. But they have earlier drafts are definitely given like S162A / small Roman, little I. And so that way you can at least add, if they find a third draft, you can just add a 3 or something like that to it. So that's definitely something that they do. So let's go ahead and I'm gonna just give you a sense of what the final version of this piece sounds like. And then we'll move on to the next one. And so this is the Angelus. So it's a lovely piece. You can hear it very proto-impressionist in some ways. Something I left out is that these little details like this, these two measures were left out of the original. Just that, it used to be. So there's little details like that that just kind of have this very nice effect. One thing that is a hallmark of this particular piano set is that you have a lot of these endings that are just single line gestures, which may seem unusual for Liszt, but as he was getting older and into more religious aspects of his music, they often tend to be there, and often they're just very beautifully done and simply put forward. So we're going to move on to the next work, which is the most recent acquisition for the library, and it's a very exciting one because it's for the first threnody, which is of the Cypress threnodies, and it was unknown before it came onto the market that there was this manuscript even exists. And in fact, it's two manuscripts. It's a holograph manuscript in Liszt's hand, and then you have, that represents an early version of it, and then you have a copyist manuscript with further corrections and changes also in Liszt's hand. So it's a very different kind of a piece, a very dark piece, and it's it's like a not a well, maybe like a dirge or something like that is kind of a more or another way to describe it. Let me just pull it out here. So with this one, what I'm going to do is show you some of the main points of departure from the original and this one. And it starts to deviate quite a bit. There's actually an entirely new middle section to the piece that people haven't heard. And you can see why Liszt moved away from this, but you can also see how he incorporates elements of these things that he ends up getting rid of into other pieces in the set. So it helps to actually make an argument for the set of the whole third book as being making sense together as a cycle. So it helps to contribute to that, just having these sketches and these other types of materials. So on the first page of it, there's actually a flap, and I found some material on the underside of this flap that gives a little bit of a sense of what he might have been going for. So here's how it is, this little passage, here's how it is in the final version. So that's the final version. Here's an original version that I've kind of made fit, I think, the way he was originally looking at it. So you can hear a very different descending line and also a little slightly faster harmonic rhythm there. So that's the first spot. So here's another way he's transitioning into kind of another lugubrious middle section. And it seems like it gets lost a little bit. And he crosses this out, and eventually he's not expecting anybody to do this. And so this is really unfair, actually, because Liszt said no to this, but I'm playing it anyway. So don't hold it against him if you don't like something. But there are elements of it that are quite beautiful in and of themselves. So I think we can veto Liszt here and say, let's hear it anyway. That's instead of. So it's like this extension. And then after this big section, after this big section, it goes in a very different direction. And so I'm going to play, this is material that he didn't do anything with, although it, again, appeared a little bit later. We hear stuff like it. So after we've been building up, it turns into this. So I just butchered that end part, but that's, but the idea, you get the idea that there's this material that's being used, and it sounds slightly familiar because he did end up using it in the final version, just in a very different way. So first of all, this newly material we've heard before from the section preceding it, but this stuff where it's going, that kind of material is used quite differently. And the way that, let's see, so what you'll hear, I'll try to play this a little bit slower so you can hear it, it gets turned into this kind of massive buildup. So this little offset thing eventually morphs into that, and its role there is transitional between sections. So it's something that's like a proto idea that he thought of a way to do something different with it later. Then towards the end, we get this gorgeous chordal section that goes through the very end, and he had several different ideas about how to handle this. And I'm going to pull up. I'm going to do a combination of the two versions so that you can just hear it back to back instead of playing the full thing twice. Here it is. So what's interesting here is that I'll just play this little section, and then I'll play another section that's slightly elongated. Continues from there. So it's this really beautiful thing that he rejected. So instead of that, here's a second version had something similar to that, but a different kind of ending at this, as it moves on. Oh, here it is. So just from the very end of that, you hear. So that's a very different type of an idea, and this was the second copyist manuscript that Liszt added that in, and then crossed it out. So the actual version of that I can play with it also. So you hear instead, on from there. The last thing I'll show you about this piece until we get to the end are these multiple attempts he had at this change when it gets to the 4/4 section at the end of the piece, which I'll just play a little bit of what it turns out in the final version. It just has this, it comes to rest here. Continues like this, you'll hear it in a moment. But in the version that he did, his first attempt was this. Oops, alternates between those two chords. Then he goes off a little bit and it doesn't quite work out, so he starts over and goes to this. Without the C sharp I added. He's still trying to figure out what to do harmonically here. And I think that his instincts were that you could do all kinds of things, but maybe it was better to be simpler in the end. And so I'm going to play through this piece so you can hear what it's like. And just know that there's just a lot of depth in this manuscript that's really interesting to look at. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Au Cypressen de la Villa, in this manuscript version, it was den Cypressen der Villa. So the cypress trees, and then it has as a subtext threnody. So like an elegy. That's the word I was looking for. That's better than dirge, I think. This opening is fantastic because it's in G minor, but you hear B flat to F sharp, and that's how it's spelled. And so it immediately is like you're playing a third, but it looks like you're playing a fourth of some sort. So it's like sets it up so interestingly to me. don't know if you caught it there, but in the center I tried to pretend like I was trying something different in the way that Liszt did in the manuscript to give it a more realistic version. Yeah, I mean, maybe. But yeah, I mean, he's definitely, it's one thing that you can tell from the manuscripts is that Liszt was, of course, a great improviser. And sometimes, and this is what you'll see in this next piece that we're going to take a look at, is that what he would do is he basically would create a continuity draft where he'd come up with an idea that is maybe not going to be the final idea, but it's stuck in there so that by the time he gets around to rewriting it or editing it, he has a full kind of section to deal with. So that is something that he does in these other pieces. So the next piece we're going to take out is actually has the same name in our manuscript. It's Den Cypressen der Villa, and ends up having the same name in the final set as well. But it's called the second threnody. So this one is quite beautiful and quite interesting in a different way. And what we find from the manuscripts here, and this is a sketch. It's not a complete draft. There's another continuity draft that's related to this that's been recorded, but not this section, this sketch that we're going to take a look at. But you can already see that he's working with different harmonies and things like that. So that's where kind of more of the interesting things come into play here. So for instance, from the very opening of the piece, the original way that he had it was this. And then in the final way, it's. So the difference there is that he puts an F sharp in the bass to then move down. That's the only difference, but it ends up having this very different feel to it when it starts. It's just crunchier and more chromatic, even though that's a whole step there. So that's one of the things that comes into play. Also this, and I should have mentioned this all along, is that there's this thematic transformation that's happening with these very simple melodies throughout. And so in the final version, the one that matters here is, and then eventually you hear just an extension of that idea. But in the initial draft, Liszt had a very different idea. He changed that melodic line to this. So it's not that just a leap down and then a chromatic scale up. It's a very interesting other type of alternative melody. And then that leads into some different kind of material. In the final version we hear. In this one we hear this. First early version we hear this. There's nothing inherently better about what he ended up with. In fact, that one has a resolution, more dissonance to it, and is kind of interesting. You might say more interesting in the abstract, but maybe it didn't fit quite the way he wanted it to in the actual piece. He then turns that that idea gets turned into a bigger one when it comes back. And then the same thing. So that same kind of different way of dealing with those chords comes into play. When he introduces another theme, that's how he ends up. That's where he ends up. But in the original version, it's this. lose a couple of measures, and the harmonic rhythm is very different also there. So that's one of the changes, and then we have the next section, another substantial type of change. Here's how it was originally in the early manuscripts. And so forth. And then when Nick's doing it, this is a weird thing to turn pages for, so kudos to Nick, thank you. And the final version is this. Oops. So it's a bit fuller, more chords, and a little bit more ostentatious, if you will. Then at the end of that section, he keeps it very simple in the final version. But in the original version, it was this. So quite a different harmonic setting of that same material, which I think is kind of fascinating to see. But he moved away from that. Then we get to this kind of, not bizarre section, but one that's often hard to make heads or tail out of, with these arpeggios that go up. I think they're meant to go up to the top and then just kind of spill down. In the original version, what we have is this. So it's a foreshortened version, and then kind of a very simplified moving on. Now this transition, where it's going from this, I have to play these back to back so you can hear what they sound like. It goes to this. Thing, we hear that Liszt actually expands that entire section, but by the time he gets to that similar passage that we just heard, he's changed it quite a bit into this very hauntingly beautiful idea. And that's, again, it's all based on that same idea. He's added a contrapuntal line as well, so it's a very interesting change that he makes there. He does the same thing with the repeated section. Remember I said lots of these things come in two with the different versions. And then we lose a big chunk where he just moves into different territory. And this territory sounds like this. Into what you think is going to be B major. Now check the manuscript, and it definitely has the 4 sharps A natural there. So that's a a similar treatment to what we heard earlier in that version. In the version with the that he ends up with, sounds more like this. So the role of the tremolo is reversed. So in this case, now you have the melody and the bass, and the tremolo in the right hand, whereas originally they were the opposite. The last thing I think I'll show about this particular version is another interesting harmonic arrival. So after this passage of bigger stuff gets done, it goes. After this point, it just kind of drifts away. There's a little bit of arpeggio stuff, and then it just kind of goes away. And we're close to the end of the piece, but it's just not quite the end. So now I'm going to play through this one, so you can hear what the final version sounds like. Thank you. So for the last piece we'll take a look at, well, first of all, you'll notice that it again had that single line ending, which is just kind of I think an inspired stroke there. But it's also something that keeps consistent throughout the piece as a whole. This last piece that I'm going to play, which is the last one that we have, is the fifth in the series. It's the last one we have manuscript material for. It deviates quite significantly from what the final version is. So I'll play passages here that are just completely different. It also dates earlier. I believe 1867 might be around the first draft, but it's not quite clear when it was. But it's another type of threnody, basically, but this time the title, Sunt lacrimae rerum, there are tears for these things. And he says it's in a Hungarian mode, and most likely referring to the 1848-49 revolution, and also the types of friends that he lost at that time. One reason that it's a definite tie-in for that is that the historical Hungarian portraits that he wrote around in the 1870s, a little bit later, also very specifically named these people, some of whom died in the revolution. And then he also uses some of the similar material, if not the same, in certain spots. So that's one way that we can kind of hear what's going on. So I'll just play a couple of major different sized in the final version. Comes back to it there. Again, Liszt crossed this out, so he doesn't want you to hear it, but we played it anyway. So in the original, it doesn't have that whole section. This idea that is here, let's side by side. The original version, we hear this. Version, we hear this. So we have an extension by a measure. This happens three other places in similar types of ideas like that. I won't play them for you, but that is, these are additions that he made in the later versions as opposed to subtractions. So I awkwardly undo that. There are little differences that you find. You hear really fast repetitions, where in the final version it's just little things like that mean more to the pianist that it's changed, so it's a little easier to play in the later version. So he was kind there, at least. And then you have this really strange, tumultuous, low area that ends in a cadenza in the original version. And here's what that sounds like. I won't give away the nice surprise that's in the original, but. Actually has an alternate version there. I'll just play the end of that, which is. And so that's very different from the final version, but you'll hear what he does differently there when I play it in a minute. Then we get to the more Hungarian section, which has a very boring accompaniment part at the beginning. At least that's my opinion. Differences from the original, which you'll hear, or the final, which you'll hear. Then we have another type of change, which is this. And it continues something like this. On just keeping that same basic, but I can't see it underneath. It's something like that. Then he gives up on that. I don't think he actually gives up on it. I think he just covers it up with the music that you hear. And then you get to this very wild ending, which is harder. Well, I shouldn't say that because I'll jinx myself, but harder in some ways than the final version that he did. It definitely has these triplets in the right hand as opposed to duples in the final version. That's how he ends the piece. You'll hear that it's quite different from what he ends up going for, and actually it seems a bit on a more positive note than what he finally ends up going with. So the last thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to play through this piece, and then first of all I want to thank everybody for being here, and afterwards I'll be happy to show you some of the manuscript items we have up here and turn pages for you and stuff like that. So it's kind of part of the point, is just to get a chance to look at the actual things and see how, what kind of adaptations I've made from them. All right, thanks. So this is Sunt lacrimae rerum. So thanks again for coming, and it's a kind of a strange ending. We can talk about that too. But why don't you come on up and take a look at the manuscripts?
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.